Hello world, and welcome to the second edition of JacobMakes. If you watched my last video, you saw me make a box for rolling my D&D dice, and suffered through some borderline potato quality video and audio that sounded like it was recorded in a tin can rolling down the highway at interstate speeds. I'm sorry about that. But when you work the way I do, just kind of hacking things together with whatever's laying around, the first attempt is usually pretty messy. But now I'm back,
and I'm better than ever. Well, as far as video production is concerned, in terms of day-to-day life, there's still all of the 2020 going on. Now, the upshot of 2020 is that we're spending pretty much all of our time at home, so we're getting a lot more quality time as a family. Now, while this has allowed us to generate such lovely family memories as the toddler pooped in her rocking chair, it's also causing my wife to slowly drive herself insane. See, she's a compulsive reader. She's also a librarian, meaning there's no limit to the number of books she can bring home at one time, and she gets first dibs on checking out anything that gets returned. Now, normally this would be a book lover's dream, but she also displays a need for organization that occasionally borders on the neurotic, and abhors seeing a single thing in our house without its own dedicated space. Taken together, this means that much like a diabetic with a sweet tooth who works at a Little Debbie factory, she spends 40 hours a week surrounded by the irresistible objects of her own undoing. Despite the 4 bookcases already in our home and the boxes of books in storage in our closet, there were books on our entertainment center, books on the back of our couch, books on our desk, even a small collection of books in a little caddy that she could carry outside to read in her hammock while our kids ate the contents of their sandbox. Now, these books didn't bother me in the slightest. My personal approach to organization can best be described as, yeah, I'm pretty sure I remember what pile that's supposed to be in. But Lindsay found herself unable to relax, surrounded by all these transient books. Clearly, what we needed was more dedicated space for books in our home, and that meant putting in a 5th bookcase. Now, because she needs things that are within sight of each other to match, our initial plan had been to buy another of the 5-tiered bookcases already in our family room. Being the product of a certain Swedish modular furniture manufacturer, they were pretty cheap, and we've always been happy with the other 2. But that plan had a few drawbacks. First, modular bookcases were apparently right there behind toilet paper and Lysol wipes on the list of things that everyone stockpiled when lockdown started, and we've been unable to reserve one through the retailer's online store for pickup. We figured we could just wait until demand died down, but as the summer wore on, the strain on Lindsay's mental state started to show. The repeated cycle of these scattered stacks of books growing taller, followed by week-long binges where she could bring herself to do nothing but read just for the purposes of getting books out of our house, had gotten shorter and more frantic with each iteration. So our need was getting increasingly desperate. Now, why not just have one delivered, I hear you asking from the comment section? Well, that brings us to our second problem. See, we've used this retailer's home delivery service in the past, and I won't get into specifics, but we were wronged by those dastardly Swedes. Never again. Thirdly, the space Lindsay wants this bookcase to fill is actually significantly wider than the bookcase as produced. So if we could have a custom width, not only would it look better visually, it would also hold more books. So I decided I was just going to build this thing myself from scratch. Not only would that allow us to have the bookcase as quickly as I could put it together, it would allow us to fully customize it, all without giving a single cent to those underhanded purveyors of lies. Honestly, this leans so heavily, in my experience in the consumer products world, that I'm pretty excited about what this thing could be. I mean, I could build the shelves so they adjust on rails. I could make it any color we want with any number of cool quotes or designs carved into it. We could build in a secret compartment for keepsakes. We could put in Arduino electronics for cool interactive lighting, lest people think all I do on this channel is woodworking. The possibilities are endless. Now all I have to do is sit down with the customer and get the specs. Okay, so you want a bookshelf? Because we have one over here that's very small. You're wanting one more like our big ones over here.
Yes.
like I can do so much more than that. So I like anything you can imagine for like a bookcase is kind of on the table. I can at least make an attempt. So I just wanted to talk through like can do like built-in lights, can do like decorations, can do like interesting finishes and colors. Like
I don't think lights make a lot of sense because I just turn on the light switch and I can see.
mm-hmm.
And I don't know that you have the know-how or set up to run power to a bookcase on that wall anyway.
Okay. I feel attacked, but we'll step past that. I just mean like you're married to an engineer, right? Like I can do so much. Like I can build cool mechanisms. I could build like a secret compartment into it. Like I can do a lot of cool things. I just want to make sure before I build a bookcase, given that you can get anything that you want, that what you want is just like featureless matte white bookcase.
The books are the feature. I want it to be white.
Okay.
To match the other bookcases. I want it to be roughly the same dimensions, spacing of the shelves so that it looks like a matching set. So we can make it a little bit wider, but about the same height. I'm boring and not exciting, but
I'm just saying, like you could use your imagination. Like this is totally custom. Like all of those HGTV shows, like people always lose their mind over like custom stuff. Like anything that you want. Again, I can at least make an attempt. I can't promise I could, make it levitate or something, but
you could have all of my favorite books on it.
Okay. Well, I think I have what I need.
I think you do too.
Okay. Well, this is different. In my career, I'm used to people asking for everything. Things that don't even make sense. Like, hey, can the inside of this be bigger than the outside? Or can you make this heat sink out of incredibly meltable plastic instead of highly conductive aluminum? I've never been asked to do so little. But the customer's always right? So I'm making a copy of this existing Swedish design. For the purpose of this video, let's call it the William bookcase. It's my grandfather's name, works as well as any. Doesn't have to have any similarity to any existing copyright. Well, guess I should, no, I don't have to do any design work because I'm just copying the existing design. Guess I just need to take some measurements and go buy wood. I take my trusty tape measure and I grab the depth and height of the existing bookcase, making sure to note the center of every shelf as well as the height of the foot portion at the bottom and how far back it's inlaid. I then measure the width of the existing space the bookcase needs to go in and find out we want about a 42-inch wide bookcase. With these measurements recorded on my phone, I head to my friendly local hardware store and start shopping for wood. I'd like to tell you that there was some kind of expertise or knowledge informing my purchase, but I just went with the cuts that would give me the least amount of scrap and the least amount of wood to buy. That wound up being 5 3/4-inch thick 8-foot by 1-foot whitewood boards for the actual frame of the bookcase, a 3/4-inch thick 4-foot by 4-inch whitewood plank for the foot portion, and then a trio of 4-foot by 2-foot plywood boards for the backing. A little bit of post-purchase Googling revealed that whitewood isn't a specific kind of wood. There's not like a whitewood tree or anything. It just refers to a category of woods like pine and I think poplar that have a bright finish and lend themselves well to taking any color stain or paint. But apparently it's one of the preferred choices for building furniture, and it just fit in my wife's SUV. So off we go. If you watched my last video, you saw me do a lot of wood cutting with an oscillating cutter. It worked, but God, did it take forever. Just hours of my life needlessly wasted. So this time I bought a small circular saw. You'll probably notice that most of my tools are made by Dremel. They don't sponsor me or anything, though I would absolutely take that deal. I just like how multi-purpose their tools are. Pretty much every job I've ever worked has had a tool room with a bunch of Dremel tools in it, and they've always gotten the job done for me, so I don't know, maybe I'm just a creature of habit. With my new saw and all of the wood purchased, it's time for the most important step of the building process, finding a place to put my camera. Whew. See, my last build was something small enough that I could hold it in my hands, so I could do all my work on my workbench with the camera just set up to the side a little bit. But with this, the sides of this bookcase are going to wind up being about as wide as my workspace, and the stock pieces I'm starting from are even wider than that. Eventually, I gave up on making my bench work for filming and just used an old cabinet as a workspace. Now, because these pieces are rectangular, there's not a whole lot of complicated measuring and marking that needs to happen. I just use the square I bought last year for measuring drywall and measure the length and width of each piece. I then use my incredibly loud circular saw to cut out each of the pieces. Next, I take my two side pieces and I actually tape them together so they line up as close as possible. Then I take my sander and I try to smooth out as many of the small differences between the two pieces as possible. Now, with the pieces still taped together, I take my square and my tape measure, and as precisely as I can, I try and measure the location where I want each of the through holes for the screws that will hold the shelves in place. My logic here being that even though I'm using a square and a tape measure to be as precise as possible, there's still going to be some error in each of those locations. So if I do each hole individually, they might not line up side to side. But if I just mark one piece of wood and drill through both at the same time, they should line up more or less perfectly. With the holes drilled, I went back to my sander and I rounded off every single edge on every piece of wood to match the look of the existing bookcase. Unlike my last project, this time I was sure to wear a mask, so I didn't breathe in all of the sawdust that this was kicking up. Just like my last project, this took forever and was murder on my forearms. Two obvious things to improve. One, have a mask that creates a tight fit around your face, mouth, and nose. That's the only way really to ensure that you're not going to breathe in any sawdust. That's what's recommended, but I don't have one of those. And the paper mask at least stopped some of the particles from getting in. I at least felt better afterwards. And secondly, if you're going to be putting a nice rounded edge on a wooden piece, you really want to use a router. And there are bits that put a certain radius on a sharp corner. And I have the bits, but I don't actually have a router. So maybe that'll be something I buy for my next project. With everything sanded, I start working on making holes for dowels to fit into. If you ever put together a piece of this Swedish furniture, you know that there are dowels everywhere in these things. Screws are great for pulling things together, but nice, well-fitted dowels in your assembly will make sure that the screws don't have to take any sideways or shear loading, and they make the whole assembly more robust. But you need to be very careful with how you locate your dowel holes. If you can imagine two pieces, if the holes are off even a little bit, they'll actually stop the assembly from going together. So I decided what I need is a rigid guide piece, something that will help me locate each of these dowel holes relative to the existing screw holes that I've already drilled. In theory, if I'm using the same rigid guide every time and using existing holes every time, I should get about as exact a location as possible. So I take a piece of scrap wood and I drill a hole through it that's the same size as the existing through holes. Then I take my Dremel with my end mill bit and I make a second hole on the piece an inch or two away. Once I have this piece, I can take one of my screws, the threads of which are almost exactly the same diameter as the through holes, and place my guide piece to locate my dowel hole. So I try it. And you know what? It doesn't work at all. The wooden guide, predictably, is getting eaten by the end mill. And because wood isn't uniform, the bit doesn't want to go straight down into the workpiece. And my arms aren't strong enough or precise enough to hold it exactly in place, so I wind up with a hole that's actually significantly larger than the bit I'm using, meaning it's too big to work as a press fit for the dowel stock I have. So rather than putting a bunch of time and energy into putting probably useless holes in this thing, I just pull the ripcord and decide to stick with screws. With the machining of the main pieces essentially done, all that was left was work on the aesthetics. The stock wood that I bought was full of some little and not so little defects, So I turned to the tried and true solution of mediocre woodworkers everywhere: wood putty. Everywhere I found a defect, and there were a lot of them, I filled it with wood putty. I gave everything a little time to dry and then sanded it down. Now, in my last video, I would usually wait an hour or two before doing the sanding, and this worked just fine. But this time around, I think I'm understanding why the box said to wait 24 hours to let the material fully cure. See, even though the outer surface was hard to the touch, sanding in to the putty this time around, especially on some of these deeper defects, revealed putty that was still tacky, and it actually gummed up my sanding pads. I ruined 3 separate sanding pads during this part of the video, but I can buy more of those. I can't buy daylight hours without the kids hanging on me, so I pressed on. With everything filled and sanded, it was time to work on painting the individual pieces. Now, I could have waited until the end to paint the pieces when the bookcase was all together, but then you'd have paint pooling in the joints between the pieces, and it wouldn't match the same clean look as the bookcase we're trying to mimic. So painting beforehand was really the only option. The one caveat there is that we do have through holes in the sides of our bookcase for the screws that go all the way to the outside of the bookcase. And the bookcase we're trying to mimic has completely clean faces. So I actually leave the exterior faces of the sides unpainted for now, knowing I'm going to have more cleanup work to do after I actually get the bookcase assembled. Well, I say I left them unpainted. I should point out at this point that Lindsay actually did the painting, at least for this part of the build. See, she had been juggling both kids all day, so I could have some time to work on this, and asked me to take them to go get dinner so she could have a chance to do literally anything else for a few minutes. I actually came back to find her painting while listening to an audiobook on the history of the indigenous peoples of the United States, because even when she's not reading, she's still reading. All that was left for me to paint were the 3 backing pieces. Now, I realized as I was doing this that I probably should have sanded the faces of these down before painting, because there is some really aggressive grain pattern showing through. But I just used 3 coats of paint and leave it at that. With all of my pieces painted, I'm ready to start putting together a bookcase. I do still need guide holes in the actual shelf pieces, and I need them to line up more or less exactly with the through holes that I've already drilled through the sides. So I'm actually going to use those through holes as guides for the pilot holes. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to have to make sure that all of the pieces are in their correct position before I start drilling. To do this, I lay out all of my pieces and, using some duct tape, locate everything in its final position. Then I take my drill and drill my pilot holes. After each hole is drilled, I take my ratcheting screwdriver, which, side note, is maybe my favorite tool that I own, and I screw in each screw by hand. I actually used my drill for the first one, but it was way too torquey and actually buried the screw pretty far into the wood. Doing it manually, I can make sure that I'm maximizing the grip each screw has without destroying the wood it needs to grip into. After I've done the pilot holes on the top, I flip the bookcase over and I repeat the process on the bottom, making sure each time to orient the shelf as close to vertical as I can by eye. With that done, I now have a functional bookcase. All that's left is the finishing touches. I realized at this point that I hadn't drilled through holes in the side pieces for the foot piece. Oops. Oh well. Thankfully my cuts were good enough that I can wedge the foot into its proper place. I then drill a pilot hole for a screw on each side, and then I drill a through hole through each side piece by taping off the larger diameter bit to make sure I don't drill too deep. I add screws and the foot is in place. I flip the case over so it is face down, and then I place the first backing piece, paint side down, on the back, flush with the top and with excess hanging off of both sides. I drill some pilot holes, not bothering with through holes for thin plywood, and add screws to hold the first piece down. I repeat this process with the second and third pieces, using the bottom edge of the previous piece to locate each one. With the backing pieces in place, I take my oscillating cutter with a flush cutting attachment and I cut away the excess wood, leaving a nice, flush, uniform joint around the sides and bottom. With the backing finished, I put the bookcase upright and wood putty over those pesky exterior screw holes. I wait for the putty to cure, sand it down flat again, and then I paint the exterior faces. I also paint the joints between the backing pieces to minimize how visible they are, and touch up any defects in the first round of painting on all remaining visible surfaces. I give the paint a little time to dry, and voila, we're done. The William Bookcase by Jacob. here it is, finally in place in our family room. And here's me posing with it like a property brother. It gave Lindsay a place to put all of the kids' books, which freed up space on other bookcases for her rotating trove of library books. Our couch is clear, our television sits alone on our entertainment center, and Lindsay's no longer surrounded by these constant, inescapable reminders of her inability to instantly absorb the contents of a book through skin contact. And you know what? The kids love it too. I mean, when I first put it up in the room, they excitedly ran over to it and started grabbing all of their favorite books off of it and bringing them to me. We probably spent an hour with them reading on my lap the first day the bookcase was in the room. Look, if I'm being honest, I started out this build feeling pretty glum. I had all these big ideas for what this bookcase could be, but I kept getting told to stick to the basics, to put my imagination away and stick to someone else's basic minimalist design. Ultimately, all I did was cut out some rectangles and screw them together. And I wound up with something not that different from something I could have just bought. See, I don't like crafting things for the things themselves. For me, it's more about the challenge of figuring out how to make this thing and then proving to myself that I have the skill and the ingenuity to make it happen. I didn't really get to do that with this build. But this build wasn't for me. It was for them. And they love it. And every time my kids run over with a book from that bookcase, and every time Lindsay doesn't hyperventilate from her sprawling book mess, I get to know that that's because of a thing I made. As cool as it is to make something interesting for yourself, it feels even better to make something for someone else that's exactly what they need, even if it's plain and derivative. And all it cost me was a few weekend afternoons, $100 in materials, and a toenail. Well, until next time, keep messing up and acting like that's what you meant to do all along. It's always worked for me. Happy crafting, Internet.